Okay, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk with you all today. The talk today is called Acoustics with Spruce Tonewood, Nature and Nurture. I'm Dave Olson. I started working with Pacific Rim Tonewoods about 8 years ago. And by day, I'm an otologic surgeon, a surgeon of the ear. And thus, I'm not a luthier, but I do want to make the point that I do run a musical instrument repair shop. Every time I step into the OR to fix an eardrum, or to take care of the bones of hearing in the ear, or even to place a cochlear implant, I'm thinking of the science of acoustics. When we're dealing with the larynx and the voice box, it's all about the science of acoustics. It turns out that the science of acoustics applies to everything that's compelled to vibrate rhythmically and in resonance. This became quite obvious to me when I first started working with these guys, because a few years ago in the Journal of Otology, in the Journal of Ear Surgery, there was a paper that was looking at the natural resonances of the human eardrum. And when we look at these, we look at holographic images of what are called modal patterns. Now, modes are the shapes that a material will vibrate in. And as we can see at low frequencies and mid frequencies, we see these rather simple modal patterns. And as the frequencies increase up to higher frequency, we see these modal patterns become numerous and kind of break up. If any of you are interested in guitars and guitar research, this may look familiar to you, because guitar tops do exactly the same thing. At low frequencies, we see these simple modal patterns as the soundboard is moving in and out. At the higher frequencies, we see these modal patterns become numerous and kind of chaotic. They break up. And it's not too surprising that eardrums and guitars vibrate in exactly the same way. Because if you think about it, the human ear evolved and was designed to pick up the resonances of nature. And the guitar has evolved to please the human ear. Now, this is kind of cool, right? But this by itself wouldn't justify my talking with you today. And it wouldn't justify my working with Pacific Rim Tonewoods. I did have a previous life as well. I was a forest ecologist right out of college and did a master's thesis at the University of Minnesota on the forest ecology of ancient spruce forests. Now, it had nothing to do with Tonewood at the time, but this was about 30 years ago. And at this time, forest scientists were just beginning to do wood testing in a modern way. Classically, when we tested the strength and stability of wood, we would do so by this kind of brute force method. This is called static testing. We'd apply a heavy force on a board and just basically measure the deformation, even unto destruction. This is a destructive method. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, and it turns out that using the science of acoustics, we can actually derive these same principles, these same characteristics, in a way that's non-destructive and very quick. And so we can do so with ultrasound. And here's Andy Powers of the Taylor Guitar Company using the Lutschke meter. And we kind of borrowed this idea from him to measure the velocity and thus the stiffness across a soundboard top. Now, many of you at the mill are familiar with the Hitman. And this is a device where we can scale up and measure an entire log by virtue of striking the end of it, inducing an acoustic signal and measuring the velocity of that signal, and thus derive stiffness and density measurements on an entire log. We do this for log selection. We can take that log then and cut it up and do the same thing with our kind of the center of our effort here called the Bing, and we'll talk more about this later. It was through this kind of insight from 30 years ago that I started working with Pacific Rim Tonewoods and hopefully making some contribution to here. And with Pacific Rim Tonewoods, it's kind of an interesting place because we're centered right here in Highway 20 in the Skagit Valley. And we're kind of in the northern central part of Washington, just west of the Cascades. To the west of us on the Olympic Peninsula are the world's largest Sitka spruce. Just to the east of us, up Rainy Pass, we find the world's largest Engelmann spruce. And so it's here in this rather picturesque valley that Pacific Rim Tonewoods was founded about 40 years ago by Steve McMinn. And so what I'd like to do today is kind of touch on the milling practices, the reason why Pacificum Tonewoods does what it does and how it does a little bit, because that's a good entree into the acoustic testing and the importance of acoustic testing. I'm then going to talk about some of the proof of concept testing, the perceptual testing we do by taking the test wood, actually building guitars and determining what they sound like. And that then will lead into how we actually do acoustic grading and bring these materials to the marketplace. Now, a few words on milling. This is a standard round, a 22-inch length of spruce, 22 inches being approximately the length of a dreadnought soundboard. They're bucked up in the log yard into these lengths and then importantly split on the log deck. This is Steve McMinn splitting this, not cutting it, but splitting it along the grain. And in so doing then, the cut, if you will, the split follows the long grain of the wood. Every tree has a little bit of a twist, as we'll see in a moment. And by splitting it in this way, we ensure that the wood is perfectly quartered. The annual rings come up and meet the face of this at exactly a 90-degree angle. And those of you who are interested in guitars will kind of see that this kind of looks like a soundboard already. We've got this beautiful grain. We've got these horizontal, what we call medullary rays that indicate perfect quartering. And this kind of looks ready to go, except it's not quite a soundboard yet. We then take this billet of wood and treat it in a very special way. We put the billet on a head rig and a bandsaw, and a very skilled operator named Derek Schmidt uses a laser guidance, uses a rear camera to perfectly orient this so that the face of the wood, which is perfectly quarter sawn on this side, is also as close to perfectly quarter sawn on the other side. Now this is done over and over and over again. The boards come off the head rig in such a fashion, they're then squared off and placed into a flooring saw that gives you these perfectly quarter sawn tops, book matched. And we do this over and over and over again. The final product looks something like this. Now, this is done 300,000 times per year. Approximately 300,000 guitar tops are produced per year, and about 1 million linear feet of brace wood, which is the wood that ultimately goes underneath the guitar. These pieces are cut into the brace wood patterns of differing types, and that undergirds the soundboard for support. When I first started working here, I was astounded by the scale of this, because you can imagine 300,000 guitar tops per year, but until you see it in the warehouse, I couldn't even imagine there was this much spruce in the whole world. But it's something that you folks at the mill see every day. It just really is quite astounding to see it right here in the flesh. The question that comes up is, why is accurate milling important? Why is it that Pacificum Tonewoods takes all of this care and puts it into the production of Tonewood? This is a good introduction into acoustics. And in order to do that, I think it's helpful to step back a little bit and look at the anatomy of wood. A tree is made up of billions of these tiny little cells called tracheids. These are hollow cells that are approximately the width of a human hair, but do have some variability. As a hollow stem, the walls of these are made of cellulose and hemicellulose. Cellulose is incredibly stiff and dense. It can kind of be thought of as nature's carbon fiber. But perhaps a more accurate way of looking at that is that carbon fiber is really man-made cellulose. This is nature's way of producing a building element that's a little bit like rebar, and cellulose is a little bit like the concrete. Cellulose provides the spacing between these stiff elements. And this is all put together into the wall of this tracheid. Now, if you've heard the term microfibril angle, what that's referring to is this angle right here. This is the angle that the microfibrils of cellulose make. The more vertical that angle, the stronger and stiffer the wood. The more horizontal, the weaker and less stiff. And this is really the reason why we have such tremendous variability in wood. And this is what we're going to talk about in a minute, but I thought it'd be important to kind of take a look at why wood has this degree of variability. This is essentially under genetic control. And this is one of the things that we can measure now, especially with the Hitman out here, where we're measuring the entire log and basically getting an average microfibril angle, an average stiffness and density across that log. Now, there's also another twist that's sometimes confused with microfibril angle, and that is that every one of these tracheids put together, billions of them on a log, are basically going to have a pattern up the trunk. And that's going to be a slight spiral pattern, as we've already seen. It's here illustrated in kind of an exaggerated way, but if we were to take this log that has this kind of slight spiral growth and treat it like any other sawmill in the world would, we could have a board that's taken down the middle of it. It might be perfectly quarter sawn with a vertical grain, but that board is going to have expressed in it that degree of runout, we call it, that angle cut across the grain. How important is this? Well, it's certainly visually important, because when you take a board like this with angled grain and you split it, you essentially make a mirror image, and you end up with a guitar top that looks like this. This is actually an expression of that differential angle that we see, kind of these two-tone guitar tops. And this used to be the way it was with wood back in the day. By splitting the wood, however, we minimize this visual effect. Now, does it have a sonic effect? Does it have an effect on the physical characteristics of the wood? This is argued about ad nauseum on those guitar forms. And I always find it kind of funny with the argument, because there are actually some good data on this. About the time I was in graduate school, back in 1990, there was a German luthier who actually studied this. And this really is the definitive data on runout. If we look at stiffness on the y-axis and the angle of runout, again, that angle that the tree is in, what Martin Schleske did was he took the same piece of wood, the same log of wood, and induced different degrees of runout, and he tested the stiffness. And we can see that along the grain, that we can tolerate a few degrees of runout, and we don't really lose that much strength along the grain. So this may not be quite as important from a sonic standpoint as it is from a visual. It really isn't until we get to 10 or 15 degrees that we start losing maybe about 20% or a third of the strength and the stiffness along that grain. Now, it's a completely different thing when we look at the degree of quarter sawing. We already talked about how the milling practices here maximize how well quarter sawn wood is. Well, what happens if we get off that just a little bit? And that has a rather more profound effect. If we look at the stiffness across the grain, and here we're talking about the stiffness in this direction, we can see that we can tolerate just a couple of degrees off that perfect quarter, and then the stiffness really starts plummeting. By the time we get to 15 degrees, we've lost 2/3 of the stiffness across that. So we have wood that's basically the same density, but the strength is gone. And this is really why we do what we do at PRT. One of the first things we did when we first started studying this with a Lutschke meter was actually test this for ourselves. Here's a standard 1.5 inch wide board. If we look at the face of this, the face is usually pretty evenly quarter sawn across because of how this is split. As we have the width of the 1.5 board, the natural rings of the tree are going to start getting a little bit off quarter by the time we get to the other side of that board. And we can see that we can, again, tolerate a few degrees off quarter, but as soon as we get a little bit of quarter down here, the stiffness plummets as measured by velocity, which is directly proportional to that stiffness. So again, this goes back to the importance of the milling practices we have here. And this was really one of the reasons why we started shifting from the wide boards at 1.5 inch to the narrower boards, because frankly, it's easier to take this board and make it perfectly quartered across its entire height. I want to make the point that the Pacific Rim Tonewoods really has the best milling practices in the world, but even given those best milling practices, the question comes up, how much variability is present? And this was about the second thing we did when we first started working here. Basically took 3 pieces of wood at random, 3 pieces just like this. In this case, they were AAA LUTs, all about the same visual. They all looked great. They were all about the same density. And then we measured the stiffness along the grain. And we saw, as expected, tremendous variability. This is probably the most important slide here, because the point that we make is that there are certain things that can't be visualized and can't be milled for. They must be measured if we're going to get a handle on this degree of variability. When we do so, and we measure a whole bunch of pieces of wood, we start seeing the same pattern over and over again. We see stiffness, again, on the y-axis. We see density on the horizontal axis. We'll see the same type of graph over and over again with spruce wood. In the low density situation, the stiffness also tends to be low. And in the high density situation, the stiffness also tends to be high. But look at the degree of variability. These are 3 different species. We have Lutz spruce in green. Lutz is a hybrid between Sitka and the lower density Engelmann. And the interesting thing about that is that the variability is pretty well constrained relative to the other two, and it tends to have kind of a high stiffness to density ratio. It's above the line, if you will. And this is one of the things that perhaps makes it a good tonewood. Now, Sitka is in blue. Sitka spruce is the workhorse of the industry. And when we test this, we kind of see the same pattern over and over again because we have tremendous variability that we don't know about until we actually do the testing. At the lower densities, we tend to get a real drop-off in stiffness. And Sitka is not really known to be a great wood for small guitars, for classical guitars, for guitars that demand a low-density wood, probably because it kind of drops off in the stiffness. It has a tendency to, but again, there's a tremendous amount of variability. Red spruce, or Adirondack spruce, is in red, kind of a visual pun here. When we do that measurement, we see that variability is all over the place. So when you buy a guitar with an Adirondack top currently, we don't know if we're getting this Adirondack top, that Adirondack top, that Adirondack top. Unless we have a handle on the variability, we just don't know. That's stiffness and density. What is it that PRT actually measures? Well, density is pretty easy because density is just the average mass divided by the volume over a given piece of wood. And we measure that at 8% moisture content by kiln drying the wood and then keeping it in an environment like this where we have very tightly controlled humidity. The modulus of elasticity is the stiffness. Now I'm going to use these terms interchangeably in this talk. I'm going to try just to restrict it to stiffness, but when you see MOE or modulus of elasticity, that's essentially an intrinsic stiffness. And it arises from the cellular structure of the wood, and it's independent of the conformation of the wood. It's obviously, this piece of wood is less stiff than this piece, simply because this piece is thicker, but they may have the same modulus of elasticity. That's the point there. We measure it along the grain because that has the highest degree of variability. Once we've perfectly quartered the wood, then there really isn't that much variability across the grain. There's tremendous variability along the grain, again, because of that microfibril angle of all those cellulose fibers. So this is best measured at what we might call the scale of movement. Now what this means is that when a luthier will kind of flex a board and test it like this, maybe test a tone, what they're doing is bending that piece of wood, and we're bending it in an amplitude that's several hundred times the tiny amplitude of an acoustic signal, and we're doing so at essentially 1 hertz. Okay, there are slightly different physics that arise from an acoustic vibration, really low amplitude, and much faster. So when we're looking at measuring wood for acoustic purposes, it's actually better to use acoustic principles than it is to use that static testing. So damping is something we haven't talked about yet, but damping refers to internal friction of the wood. We'll talk more about that. And this is entirely a dynamic property. The wood has to be put into motion in order to test this. And it's essentially what one hears when you induce a board to resonate. What is the importance of these things to the acoustic properties of a guitar? Stiffness and density help to determine the natural resonant frequencies of a guitar, and I want to emphasize for a given design and build. And this became rather apparent to us in real form when we actually did the study that we're going to talk about later. We built identical guitars, 10 identical guitars through the Taylor Company, and we modified only the stiffness and density of the top. And when we did so, when we tested the resonant frequencies, the natural resonant frequencies of those guitars, we saw rather predictable shifts at each peak that were kind of the same no matter how we tested them. So that if we look at the low density and low stiffness tops, we tended to have a lower resonant frequency. The medium stiffness tended to be right in the middle, and the high density and high stiffness tended to be shifted up. These are subtle shifts, but they can have tremendously important impacts on the sound of the guitar. The point is that unless we know the properties going into the build, we might end up with something that's less than optimal, as we'll see. Now, stiffness and density also help to resolve the fundamental contradiction of guitar design, and that is strength versus responsiveness. A guitar has to withstand the static tension of the strings and the stress of playing, and yet remain flexible enough to transfer the slight energy of the strings into sound. When an engineer builds a bridge, then we have a situation where the engineer will overbuild that bridge because it doesn't matter how that bridge resonates. In fact, you don't want it to resonate. With a guitar, we always have to be thinking of a delicate balance between the strength of the top that's necessary and that very slight amount of energy that goes into it in order to vibrate it. So the stiffness and the density of the top are also directly responsible for a few things that are of interest to luthiers. And I'm going to go through just a few of those. The velocity of sound, this is the only formula in the entire talk, is the square root of the stiffness modulo the elasticity divided by the density. Now, this means that we can measure one or two and derive the others. And so this becomes kind of a means by which we can have currency with these measurements and derive one from the other. It's also important for the quality of the sound. There's something called monopole mobility. Now, the monopole mobility is essentially the average amplitude of the dominant radiant mode. Now, what does this mean? When the guitar top is vibrating, a high monopole mobility means that it's going to radiate a lot of sound. And the luthiers that are going to be looking at this talk are going to realize that I'm treating this in a very simplistic way. But the point I want to make is that we must have a knowledge of these properties in order to kind of get a handle on the variability that can come out in the finished product. There's also something called mechanical impedance. And this is really the resistance of the soundboard to the transfer of the energy from the strings. And this is kind of a simple concept. When we strike that string, that sound has to flow into the soundboard. If it comes up against a wall because the soundboard is too stiff, we get this muted tone. And we've all heard this in certain guitars. When it's too little, there's kind of an opposite problem. We get a clunky note with little sustain. This is what's sometimes known as a wolf tone or a wolf note. And it really does interfere with the evenness of the tone that flows from a guitar. So damping. Damping is essentially the decay of the amplitude of a sound wave because of the internal friction of material. All these tracheids together, millions of tracheids in this one piece of board, are all basically sliding against one another, and that creates a little friction and an acoustic vibration. That energy is dissipated as heat and not as sound. Now, we usually express this as its inverse, what we call Q, and we're going to talk about Q for the rest of the talk. Low Q equals high damping and vice versa. All right. But in general, low damping, high Q, is good for Tonewood. Because if we look at Tonewood in general, it tends to have kind of a low damping factor. Brazilian rosewood and Pernambuco are two other important Tonewoods, and these are kind of unique because they have a high density but a low damping factor. Brazilian rosewood, kind of the holy grail for backs and sides. Pernambuco is the wood that's used for violin bows. The reason that damping has an effect on loudness is kind of interesting. When we have a low damping system, think of a brass bell. You strike that bell and it rings forever because we have very little decay of that sound. The way that the ear processes that is to turn it into frequency, and the height of that frequency band in the cochlea and the organ of hearing depends upon how loud it's perceived. Even though we have the same input energy, the same what we call an attack transient, the same initial sound, the low damping system is perceived as being louder. Now, this is actually rather hard to measure, but the human ear picks this up very well. And it's best measured in spruce between 300 and 1,000 hertz. Now, the importance of this was a sort of a fact determined some years ago. But I came across this kind of late in the game because when we were trying to measure damping on actual soundboards, we weren't getting it. We weren't getting very good results. Variability all over the place. When I strike this board, we're hearing a tone at about 80 to 100 hertz. And it turns out that's in kind of a bad zone for measuring damping. Entirely by accident, we lucked out. Because the piece that we measure here at PRT has a tone of about 400 hertz. Okay, it's perfectly within this range that has been previously determined to be quite robust and good for measuring damping. Damping is also highly moisture dependent. It increases very quickly at higher humidity. And that's, again, one of the reasons why we do our testing and our storage in a climate-controlled room like this. So, the effect of damping on acoustics is that damping will affect the average loudness and the relative amplitudes of the harmonics, leading to a louder instrument and a slightly brighter tone on average. And again, this is difficult to measure. A lot of this is perceived by the human brain and not necessarily picked up by machines. However, damping will not affect the position of the resonant frequencies, and this is how it's markedly different than stiffness and density. We first saw this in a pilot study we did on Q. We built 3 different guitars with a Taylor company, 3 grand auditorium guitars, and we built them of the same stiffness and density top, but we chose wood from that population of low, middle, and high Q. And when we did the resonant frequency analysis, we saw that we didn't affect the position of those peaks at all. This is unsurprising. This is what we expected, but really it kind of is a real-world illustration, if you will, of how damping differs from stiffness and density in terms of its effect. But as we can see, damping does have a large effect. Now, we needed to find a measurement system that was quick and easy. And so when we first started this a few years ago, we did a worldwide search for the different technologies. And what we settled on was something called BING, Beam Identification for Non-Destructive Grading, out of the Sirad Wood Lab in Montpellier, France. What we learned from them is that we can easily measure a piece of wood like this by suspending the wood at its nodes of vibration, sending an acoustic signal in the form of a steel ball at the end, and measuring the output at the other end. The machine, the computer program, does something called a fast Fourier transform, where it determines the natural resonant frequencies of that board, and at the same time, with that same signal, measures the decay of the sound, and thus the damping. This is pretty cool. Within a few seconds, we can get an accurate and reproducible measurement. There's been about 5 years of toil that's gone into this, but I think we've finally got it nailed down to where we're getting very reliable results, and that's quite satisfying. Now, this brings up some research questions. If we can accurately measure these acoustic characteristics, should we? In other words, is there a perceptible audible difference in the finished instrument? And if so, is there a combination of physical characteristics, particular to a given design, that optimizes the desired tone? And if that's true, can we repeat that success and improve consistency on both large and small scales? Now, a few years ago, we were talking to Bob Taylor, the Taylor Guitar Company, and Bob listened to the presentation, and he kind of nodded along a little bit. And then the second time we talked to him, he said, wait. Okay, I don't want to hear why this is important anymore. I want you guys to show me why this is important. And okay, that's a reasonable thing. I understand that as a surgeon. Our challenge back to Bob then was to collaborate with us on a project. What if we took the tremendous variability, this is a representative sample of all of the spruce that flows out of this mill. What if we took this and instead of kind of randomly building guitars from this pool of variability, as is presently done, what if we built guitars in this way? We built guitars with particular and known density and stiffness on the soundboard. One of the bedrock principles of science is that it has to be reproducible. So if we do it once, we really need to do it twice. So we decided to build 2 different study groups for this initial study. Group 1 had variable soundboard properties, but we kept all the brace wood, the wood that undergirds the soundboard, the same, right at the mean. The second group, we varied both the soundboard and the brace together. The low density top met the low density brace wood, etc. Basically repeat the experiment in almost the same way, but subtly change it to see if we could determine the effect of the brace wood on the sound. If the brace wood is very important, we should be able to see that in the quality of the finished instrument. Another bedrock principle of science is that if we're going to study a variable, every other variable needs to be exactly the same. For this, I have to give props to Eric Warner and Justin from the mill here, who went down to Taylor and measured hundreds of pieces of wood, pin plates, tail blocks, necks, fingerboards, bridges, everything else on the guitar except for the soundboard, and looked at the tremendous variability in their climate-controlled warehouse and chose right from the center of that variability. So in other words, we're able to build guitars where the component parts, except for the soundboard, are exactly the same. Guitars have never really been built like this. We had this population of known properties of the wood, but exactly the same properties for everything else on this guitar. They were all built on the same day by the same team of luthiers. We were ready to go. Now, when we do this kind of research, it's kind of helpful to take a step back at this point and try to look around and to see who else has done this. Who else has built instruments with very exacting principles and then looked at the quality of the sound output. And so we did a literature search of the world literature. And this is the full bibliography. In other words, no one's ever done this before. But there is a body of research in science that allows us a path forward from a sort of methodologic standpoint. And it relies upon perceptual testing and something called the just noticeable difference. This is used in the food industry all the time. When a pudding manufacturer varies the amount of sugar in their recipe, they want to make sure that that change they're making in their production actually has a perceptible effect. And so they employ trained sensory testers. We also have all experienced this if we have eyeglasses, or if we, in my own field of audiology, we do hearing testing. And basically this relies upon pairwise testing. Is this better or is this better? And then you choose this one and that's your eyeglasses. Can you hear this tone? Okay, can you hear this tone? Pairwise comparisons, the classic A-B comparisons, are the best way to test certainly sonic input. Now, musical instrument perceptual testing is notoriously difficult. Uncertain and controversial results are very common, and this is nowhere best illustrated in the rather famous Stradivari secret studies that were done in the last decade. Claudia Fritz is a brilliant researcher from the Sorbonne University in Paris. She set out to determine what is it about Stradivari, the old violins, that makes them better. The first thing she wanted to figure out is how much better are they? And so she engaged in a series of increasingly complex experiments where she used trained listeners and old violins and new violins under blinded conditions. She kept finding the same result over and over again, that old instruments sounded just like new instruments. Okay, so the Stradivari secret, the real Stradivari secret from these incredibly complex tests, is that there is none. This was an incredibly controversial result, as you can imagine, because the owners of these old instruments that are tens of millions of dollars going at auction nowadays do not want to hear that their priceless instrument sounds just the same as a new instrument that might cost $5,000 or $15,000. Well, be that as it may, that was what she found as the truth. Now, the cool thing about Claudia, and she's become a correspondent of ours, a great source of information, is that she published a paper at the end of all this where she talked about her triumphs and her failures, perceptual evaluation of musical instruments, state-of-the-art in methodology. So we were able to kind of take this paper and, through other correspondences with folks like Claudia, determine our own way of doing perceptual testing. And it turns out the best way to do it is to focus on the ear. The ear is incredibly sensitive, and I want to make the point, far more sensitive than any objective instrument, far better than any machine. Now, we should incorporate both listening and playing when we do these perceptual testings, and we have to be free of bias. By that means blinded participants and blinded researchers. We have to have a high signal-to-noise ratio. In this case, the signal is the tonal output of the instrument And the noise is literally everything else. The experience, the room, the humidity of the room, everything has to be exactly the same in order to get a reliable signal to noise ratio. Now, there's also a principle known as KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Okay, short segments are very important. And when we're doing A-B comparisons, we really have to do apples to apples. We can't compare a dreadnought guitar to an orchestra model. We have to have the same model with controlled variables. And interestingly, as it turns out, precise recordings and controlled playback are really better than live performances, as was done in the Sorbonne studies with Claudia Fritz. So this is one of the things that she learned and passed on to us. The hypothesis that we had is essentially that varying the stiffness and density of the soundboard across a typical range, that is the typical output from a mill like PRT, should have a perceptible impact on sound quality as measured by expert players and experienced listeners under those blinded conditions. Varying the bracing may contribute and possibly amplify the effect of the soundboard variability. And for a particular guitar design, there may be an optimal combination of physical characteristics. Now, the first test we did was to vary the density and the stiffness, but we kept Q the same. And we did that along two axes of variability. If we keep the relationship between density and stiffness the same by putting them all on this line, that's one sort of axis of variability through this cloud of data. We also, though, can test when we keep the density the same and vary the stiffness. And so it's most efficient then to just build 5 guitars in this group and then 5 guitars in that other group. The first stage we did was a player's test, and this was kind of cool. The guitars were built down at Taylor in the way that I've described, and then we brought in 10 players from the Taylor factory. Guys like Mark Seal, who's a product specialist who goes around the country demonstrating Taylor guitars for clients and customers. These guys that we brought in know Taylor guitars better than anyone in the world. When Claudia Fritz did her research, she had to bring in players from all over the world and hundreds of millions of dollars of violins in a room. We had all of our players right here in the factory. After the players' tests, the guitars were sent to Germany, where the recording and listening tests were done. The tests were done in this anechoic chamber. This is one of the largest anechoic chambers in Europe, and the infrastructure is really important, but it's really the smarts of our lead researcher, Dr. Sebastian Merschel, an acoustician and an engineer on the faculty of the Dresden Institute of Technology. The rest of our team is Dr. Judith Beckendorf from the Dresden Conservatory and Terry Myers from Taylor Guitars. So the recordings were made in this anechoic chamber. What we're able to do with the anechoic chamber is essentially remove the room as a variable. Now, when we do a standard recording, the reverberation from the sides of the room become sort of a homogenizing effect the next time we play that back in a different room. The anechoic chamber has no reflection. It essentially means that a recording made in such an environment can be indistinguishable from a live performance. And this was proven as sort of a proof of concept of this method. Now, we were able to do very precise playing and recording with Dr. Beckendorf. And one of the interesting ways of measuring that is to look at what's called the attract transient, the first strike of the pluck of the instrument that should have exactly the same amount of energy into it. Dr. Beckendorf was able to produce tones that were within 0.7 dB of each other. That's incredible because 0.7 dB is well below the threshold of human hearing. This was just what she was able to do with her muscle memory and skill. The sequences are only 10 to 15 seconds long. Again, this is the keep it simple, stupid. The floor of the anechoic chamber is kind of cool because it's suspended on mesh, and we have 7 feet of foam wedges below that to absorb sound. So it's absorbing sound all over the place. We're handing Judith the guitars so that she is in exactly the same orientation with the microphones. The point here made is that these are made under exacting conditions. This is in contrast to the experience of the folks back in the violin study of Claudia Fritz, where each one of these folks are having a slightly different experience of a single player up on stage simply because of their location in the room. And again, this is one of the insights we got from Claudia Fritz in her triumphs and failures of her studies. For the playback, we recruited 23 experienced listeners, experienced guitar players, 13 of them pros and 10 of them amateurs, mostly from the Dresden Conservatory. And this was meant to be kind of a focus group for the typical Taylor customer base. The participants were trained prior to the test, and the tests were checked for consistency throughout. I will not bore you with those details, but the results were extremely consistent. The whole thing took about 45 minutes for all 20 possible comparisons between these 10 different guitars, keeping it simple to avoid fatiguing. Now, the results we got. In group 1, where we varied the soundboard and kept all the bracewood the same, what we see, if we look at preference score, positive preference score is better, low preference score is worse, we see that the low density and low stiffness guitars are significantly preferred over the high density and high stiffness. If we kind of go back to that original graph, we see a pattern we see over and over again, where we see the highest preferred guitars from this population down here, and kind of a hill of happiness and a valley of despair down here, and that these guitars up in this region were poorly preferred. The interesting thing is that it followed a gradient. The ranking ran all through the data in a very sort of predictable and even way. In the second group, where we varied the soundboard and bracing, these are different guitars. They're using sister sets because we actually took the soundboards from the same block. We're able to make 2 guitars out of each of these blocks. And so each of these guitars had a sister in the other group. In this case, the bracewood varied along with the soundboard properties. Now remember, this is a completely separate test using the same listeners, and all they're doing is listening to a couple of different sequences, a couple of different tones. They have no ability to induce bias here because they have no idea exactly what they're listening to except for the preference of the sound. The results of this group. My speaker's notes say, pause here to induce a drum roll and for dramatic emphasis, because the results were exactly the same. The low density and low stiffness instruments were highly preferred. The high density, high stiffness instruments were preferred. It went in exactly the same order with statistically significant differences. So again, using essentially a replicate, essentially the same experiment run twice, we got exactly the same results. This is essentially unheard of in perceptual studies, and it really points out the fact that we have a robust and really reliable result here. Now, we wanted to do kind of a winner's circle because what we're interested in also is if we vary the bracewood along with a soundboard, does it have a little nudging effect? And so what we did was compared the 3 best guitars in each group. What we found is there's no real difference. There's no real statistically significant trend here. And what this means is that there's really no significant effect of the bracewood alone. Now, there are some subtle effects in that co-varying the bracewood kind of pushes the preference in each direction, both low and high, and we'll see that in a minute. But it doesn't really have a significant effect. The soundboard is really what has a significant effect on tone. So let's go back to that players test. You remember the very first thing we did was recruited 10 players from the Taylor company, intimately associated with Taylor guitars. The instruments were played in 2 groups of 5, selecting a favorite and ranking the rest, kind of like you're in a guitar shop. You want to pick out the one you're going to take home and rank the rest of them. Now, there were very diverse results here, and in a sense, asking a group of players, like the 10 best Taylor players in the world, to give a simple indication of their mere preference might be too simple a question. For example, we had a guy named Andy Lund, who's a product specialist who, again, goes around the country and represents Taylor guitars, playing them in front of clients and audiences. And he said something in the beginning that was very interesting. He just made a statement as we were doing the testing, I love extremes. I don't like averages. Now, he played these instruments, and all he knew was the tone. He didn't know anything else about the experience. But the middle guitar in each group, he placed dead last in his preferences. And in group 1, he chose the low density, low stiffness instrument. In group 2, he chose the high density, a high stiffness. And so his stated objective of wanting to experience those extremes of the Taylor sound were manifest in his own ranking. So In aggregate, this test was not as robust as the test in Dresden, but basically the lower density and lower stiffness instruments were preferred by most folks. No one in this group of 10 chose the ranking in exactly the same order as the later Dresden test, with one exception. Andy Powers. Andy is something of an auditory genius. He's a tremendous player, a really great guy, and has the best set of ears I've ever experienced. But when he played these instruments, he came up with a ranking in both groups that was really quite interesting. In group 1, where the soundboards varied, the bracing was kept in the medium, his best preferred guitar was, again, this low-density, low-stiffness instrument. He gave indications like, this is lively, this has a good low-end response. The one he liked best out of all 10 tended to be the instrument where the bracing and the soundboard co-varied. And this is the guitar where he indicated that this guitar has more bloom and life in the trebles. This is the most lively. It's another way of saying this is the one that really pops when I play it. At the other end, where the guitars were stiff and heavy, he indicated that this one was too mushy. This was flabby for fingerstyle. This is medium in density but high in stiffness. The one that's highest in stiffness and density sounded tight, stiff, sharp on the attack. This is another way of going back to that impedance that we talked about earlier, where if the soundboard is too stiff, the string's energy is going to bounce off, and the sound coming from the guitar will sound a little tight, is how most people describe it. In group 2, he indicated that this one was kind of muted, softer sounding, a really stiff guitar, a good ballad guitar, because Andy's really not going to say anything bad about anything or anybody. The highest density and highest stiffness guitar was tight, stiff, better when played aggressively. And again, this goes back to what's called headroom in instruments. The harder you play it, the more sound you can get out of it, but you have to play a guitar like this loudly. Now again, Andy had no other information about these instruments except the sound coming out of them, but he happened to rank both groups in exactly the same way as the Dresden test did, with the aggregate of listeners 9 time zones away and about 9 months later. This was really cool. An interesting coda on this is that he played the guitar in the middle, the one with the medium densities. This is kind of the average guitar coming out of the Taylor factory. And his notes on this said, good balance, good volume, nice middle of the spectrum. Okay, this is the auditory equivalent of a 3.5-minute mile or a 30-foot long jump. This is an amazing feat to pull off. But what it indicates is that the person who knows Taylor guitars best is probably best able to judge them. And he judged them in exactly the same way that the listening group did in Dresden. So, the conclusions. When we vary the stiffness and density over the typical range of wood, there are perceptible and significant differences in tonal quality as measured by expert players and experienced listeners. There appears to be an optimum set of characteristics of low stiffness and low density that leads to preferred tonal quality, and vice versa for this particular model. And I want to emphasize this was for this particular model. It's not necessarily extrapolatable across all guitars. Now, these results were unusually clear for perceptual testing. But what about Q? We haven't addressed Q yet. Now, we did so in the pilot study. What happens if we keep stiffness and density exactly the same, flip this experiment on its head, and vary only the Q? We select wood of high, medium, and low Q. The first test we did, the pilot study, was a Lutz Spruce soundboard and bracewood in a Grand Auditorium 314 model. This one was in the new V-braced configuration of Taylor. The Q varied over plus or minus 10%, and this represents about plus or minus 1 standard deviation from the mean of Q. The bracewood was all the same, average values. And interestingly, when we tap-toned these boards, we couldn't really tell a difference. We couldn't hear the differences in Q. We could measure the differences in Q, you see. The guitars, again, were played by Andy Powers. We've already seen how Andy has incredibly sensitive ears and is tremendously gifted in this way and others. The guitars were then sent up to Washington for kind of informal listening tests, really just some tests in my living room. And Andy's results indicated, again, without knowing what he was playing, he told us that the high Q instrument was bright, crisp, and distinguished. This is the favored guitar. Medium seemed a bit uptight, will be good if played hard for a while or played normally for about a year. And again, this is a guitar right in the middle. The low Q instrument, mushy on the low end, like a squishy soft top. It is polite, quiet, and warm. I think one other thing you mentioned is this would be a good guitar to play if you didn't want anyone in the house to hear it. All right, so when we brought these same guitars up, I was really quite blown away by how different these instruments sounded. When they played blind, 2 other luthiers in the Washington area ranked the instruments in exactly the sequence as Andy did. And in my non-specific living room test, 5 out of the 6 chose the high Q, 1 out of the 6 chose the middle Q, and absolutely no one chose the low Q guitar. Again, a blinded test. They didn't know what they were listening to except for the tones coming out of this instrument. So this pilot study gave way to a second test in Dresden. And in this group, and this time, we decided to use 2 groups of 3 guitars. One group had that low density. It's using the same guitar, the 814 Grand Auditorium model of Taylor. One group used that low density, which we already showed was the optimal property for that instrument. The other, a medium-high density. Again, this should be less preferred. But each of these had a high, middle, and low Q soundboard and bracing. So again, we're flipping this experiment on its head. In this case, we had 35 listeners, many of them the same as the first test. Otherwise, exactly the same conditions that we've already seen. And out of this tremendous cloud of preference data that results from all of these sliding scales and all of these individuals, there's really one graph that boils everything down. And I just want to show this. The paper that comes out of this is very complex, but this, I think, kind of sums things up. If we look at, again, that preference score from high to low, and we look at the blue line, this is the low density, low stiffness trio of guitars. The high density, high stiffness is down here. And if we graph them along the spectrum of Q, we can see that the high Q instrument has a significant difference. The optimized instrument is significantly better preferred than the non-optimized, the heavier instrument, if you will. This is the independent effect of Q on the sound. This is kind of like the first instrument. We had medium values of Q, just like the first instrument, but low density and high density. And again, we see this huge difference between the low density and the high density in terms of the preference. The really interesting thing is that at low Q, the effects of the optimization of the stiffness and density kind of disappear. With the low Q instruments, they both sounded kind of mediocre. Now, once again, the low density top tends to be preferred, and this is particularly true with a high and middle Q wood where the differences are significant. The low Q wood, importantly, negates the benefits of optimizing stiffness and density. There are other pilot studies we've done. The Australian luthier Trevor Gore, we built some parlor guitars, also used the Grand Pacific Dreadnought in a trio, and they all show similar results. The low Q wood tends to produce a less preferred guitar. And in the players test, we took these guitars and did the same players test with just a few players at Taylor. And again, we showed the same result. This is over and over again. The low Q guitars are described as stiff or dull. So there's a conclusion here. Stiffness and density are important characteristics which can be reliably optimized in a given guitar design. Once we've done that, once we know what properties to build into a particular guitar, the Q value, which is the inverse of damping again, has a significant effect on tonal quality, which appears to be independent of the guitar size because we've built parlor guitars to Dreadnought guitars and found the same thing, or the bracing style. We've built guitars with X-braced, Taylor guitar X-braced, Taylor guitar V-braced, and with the Trevor Gore guitars, the Falcate bracing. The Q seems to make a difference in every one of those. The low Q soundboard wood has, again, the effect of negating the optimization of the stiffness and density. This suggests to us that low Q wood should not be used for any premium guitar. So this then gives rise to an acoustic grading protocol that we can then put forth for the market for the benefit of the luthiery community. And in our grading protocol, the first step is to exclude that low Q wood. We've shown, I think, definitively that low Q wood leads to less preferred tonal quality in instruments. The second step, then, is to measure the stiffness and density, measure it and label it, but not otherwise exclude that wood except for the extremes. And when we do so, then, we come up with a graph like this. Every one of these points now has high Q, Q that's above the mean. But for the luthier wanting to get a guide as to how to build these instruments, it tends to be the case that low density, low stiffness wood tends to be good for fingerstyle and classical instruments. Wood from the medium group tends to be good for the grand auditorium, the medium-sized models, the orchestra models. And it's probably true that high-density, high-stiffness wood is good for those jumbo and dreadnought guitars where we really want a lot of headroom. We're strumming those heavily. And this then becomes the basis of our grading. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the tremendous input of Australian luthier Trevor Gore. Our grading scheme is basically something that Trevor proposed to us about 5 years ago. And all of our testing has been essentially to validate that grading protocol. Trevor and his mentor, Gerard Gillet from Australia, basically about 10 years ago put together the Bible of design and build. And Trevor holds workshops over here in Colorado and Canada that teaches luthiers how to use this information to build guitars. So our grading scheme actually works quite well with Trevor's information and Trevor's protocols, because a luthier can take the precise output from our grading protocol, place it into the formulas found in these books, and really find a way of optimizing an instrument. A luthier can also simply build the guitar they want to build, and if they like it, know that the next guitar they build using this grading scheme can be essentially the same wood. They know that they have consistency and reliability. Ultimately, it's not for us as wood suppliers to tell the luthier community how to build guitars. It's up to us to simply provide predictable and consistent materials so that we can take advantage of the wonderful diversity that nature gives us instead of being limited by it. Thanks very much. You can find more information at pacificrimtonewoods.com.